Hello and welcome to Addicted to Lacrosse. Today is Monday, February the 24th, 2014. This is episode 1.9. My name is Graham Perro. With me as always are Tyler Fitch and Melissa Daphne. And we have the Q&A app running on Google+, so head on over to our Google+ page, which we tweeted earlier, and ask some questions, and we will get to them at some point during the show. So let's get started. There was no big news this week, no transactions, trades, or that sort of thing that we were going to talk about. So we'll get right to the games of the weekend, starting with Friday night's game in Toronto. Minnesota coming to town to, Toronto, I guess, wanted some revenge for getting their butts kicked by the Swarm last year in the playoffs. And so this is the first time that we've seen the Swarm since then. And I have to say this was a pretty ugly game. Obviously, as a Rock fan, I'm happy with the result, but I didn't think the Rock played very well at all. It was odd because at one point they had a 9-goal lead. They had only allowed 4 goals in the first 3 quarters, and not only did I not think the Rock played all that well, I thought the Swarm did play pretty well, and I didn't think Nick Rose was all that good. But honestly, he wasn't really tested all that much until the fourth quarter when he collapsed completely. It was a pretty chippy game. In fact, I trying to think of another adjective beyond chippy that falls short of totally violent, but it was somewhere in between those. There was a couple of fights. I think there was actually 3 fights. 2 of them involved the same guy, Billy Hostrawser, so he was tossed from the game in the fourth quarter. And it started off okay for the Rock. Like I said, I didn't think they played really well. I didn't think they dominated, despite the fact that they had a 9-goal lead. And then they just fell apart in the fourth defensively, and the Swarm just kept coming. They scored 8 goals in the fourth quarter. 6 of them within about 5 minutes, within the last 5 minutes. And the Rock only had 1 goal in the quarter, and that was an empty netter. So I think, as I said in one of my articles this weekend, if that was a 65-minute game, we might have had a totally different result. So as a Rock fan, like I said, I wasn't happy with the result. I wasn't happy with how the Rock played. Did either of you guys see this game?
I did watch this one. It was definitely kind of crazy. I'd agree with you about the fighting in the first quarter. I mean, it was kind of crazy, and I believe Suter got booted out as well. And in the first half, it was definitely one of those games. I mean, it was a lot of back and forth, in just playing style, but Toronto was just so dominant for the first 3 quarters that for Minnesota, I mean, this is one of the games you would probably use to highlight that no lead is safe in this league, because they're heading into the fourth quarter and it's like, what was it? It was 13-4. I mean, I think 95% of the audience probably had written this game off going into the fourth quarter, that it was just Toronto had it. It was going to be another complete blowout, and that was it. And so for Minnesota to really just come back really strong in that fourth quarter, they scored like 6 of their 8 goals in the last 5 minutes. I mean, that's just kind of unheard of. I mean, Jordan McIntosh had 5 goals on 9 shots. Stefan Blanc was 3 for 6, but 5 goals on 9 shots, that's pretty dang good. So yeah, it was definitely an amazing fourth quarter. I kind of agree with you that a little bit more time and this probably would have been a very different result. And even at the end there, it almost went into overtime. Just an errant pass that Toronto came up with on an empty net, and it might have been in overtime instead. Did you see this one, Tyler?
Yeah, I was one of those people who wrote the game off. I was following the game along, seeing the total blowout happening, and 13-4 start the fourth quarter. In the fourth quarter, it's like, well, time for dinner with the family. Sat down to dinner, came back 20 minutes later, turned the tablet on, and they were doing the handshake line, talking about the importance of the empty net goal, and I think it was empty net, and it was 14-12. And it's just like, you got to be kidding me! I just missed all that action because the Swarm looked dead out of it. And I had no problem turning that game off and taking a break. So I missed the action, but Swarm gave me every reason to go miss it, and they took that excitement away from me. I didn't go back and watch the fourth quarter yet.
Well, it was definitely all Swarm in the fourth. So, yeah, Toronto's only goal was on the empty net.
Nick Rose certainly knows, or at least I hope he knows, what kind of things he has to work on. One of those things is the air gate type goals from behind the net. Of those 6 goals in the fourth quarter, 3 of them were air gates, all of them by McIntosh. 2 of them happened within, I think it was 11 seconds of each other. So he basically came down, ended up behind the net, saw his opportunity, jumped over, scored. Went right back to the next face-off, ran right down, right behind the net, did exactly the same thing again. Rose just has no idea how to solve those. And I'm not saying other goalies have got it nailed, and he's the only one who doesn't. But there certainly seem to have been a lot of goals scored against him that way over the last year or two. And as I said in my game report from that game, thank goodness for the Rock that Drew Westerveld is in the Western Division now, because we won't see him quite as often, because he did that a bunch last year as well.
Yeah, and McIntosh's air gates really weren't that pretty. Like, they were kind of a sloppy air gate. So the fact that they did go in was kind of amazing. I mean, like we were discussing a few weeks ago with Drew Westerveld. I mean, he had just some of those textbook, just beautiful, air gates, and these were just they were a little sloppy. I mean, it's always fun when they score, but it definitely wasn't pretty goals. And it was interesting hearing the announcers talk about how the second goal happened, and at first they thought it was the replay of the first goal because they were so nearly identical.
Yeah, I think Westervelt has a better handle on them because he's much taller and has obviously much longer arms, so he can kind of reach over and put the ball where he wants to. Whereas McIntosh, I don't think is that. Well, he's certainly not as tall as Westervelt. I don't know how tall he is, but it certainly the first one just looked like the opportunity's there. If it works, great. If not, oh well. And he just kind of dove and kind of threw his stick out there and tried to get the ball in, and it happened to work. Yeah, so I don't know if they were just lucky on his part or if he is actually practicing those. But anybody facing the Rock, maybe they want to practice those a little bit.
Yeah, it seems kind of unheard of for a goalie to give up 2 of those right back to back that quick. I mean, we've definitely seen them kind of spread out a little bit, but I can't recall a game where they were just dink like that. Usually the goalies fill up across the top so well when they even have a hint that there's somebody near the back.
Okay, let's move on to the other game from Friday night, which was Rochester in Calgary. I only saw the fourth quarter, I think, of this game, but I guess if you're going to see any quarter of a game, you may as well see the one with the big comeback. So that was pretty good. Did you guys see this one at all?
Yes, as soon as the Toronto game was over there, I flipped to the Calgary broadcast. Rochester was up 4-1. Shortly thereafter, it was 5-1. I was thinking, wow, totally blew this pick. I had every reason for Calgary to be comfortable and come in and dominate this game, and then I'm watching Rochester just pull away early. But it didn't end up that way at all. It was one of the most exciting games I've seen in a long time, with Calgary getting the come-from-behind victory. Great action. I loved it. I mean, it wasn't my teams at all, but it was great stuff to watch. The early on, Matt Vince was straight Matt Vince, and somehow in the second half, Calgary just kind of became fearless of him, and it's like, we're taking our shots. They were like hitting corners and very good shots, but they just started getting past Vince, and that's all it took. They just kept chipping away, and they said, if we keep shooting, they will go in and we'll get that lead. And it took them till the end there to get there, but they did, and it was great.
Yeah, unfortunately, I only saw the first half of this one, and apparently I didn't see the better half. I think I was in a bit of a mood yesterday, but we were watching it, and Rochester was up, 6-4, and even though the score said it was a close game, Rochester just kind of felt dominant, and I was just feeling like it was kind of a boring game, and so I ended up turning it off and not getting back to it. But to see the second half, how dominant Rochester was in the third quarter, and then just to completely flip, and Calgary was just as dominant in the fourth, and so it's kind of crazy when you look at the score that it was so close, and yet it's actually kind of a tale of a big comeback. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I only saw the fourth quarter, but it certainly sounded like Rochester had Rochester was dominant throughout the first three quarters of the game. And then Jeff Shatler scored a couple, and then Curtis Dixon scored a couple, and suddenly it's tied. And then Dane Dorby scores one, 2 minutes later, and now Rochester has to come back. So I guess they started to, and I'm just looking at the score sheet here, and Cody Jamieson scored one to get it back to within one, but they couldn't solve Poulin after that. So. Yeah, certainly exciting fourth quarter. It's always nice to see. Well, I was going to say it's always nice to see comebacks like that, and unless you're the team who's winning and watching the other team come back, then it's maybe less exciting.
It's kind of funny that last week was the weekend of blowouts, and this one was the weekend of comebacks. Because even though this Swarm didn't actually come back and win against Toronto, they still came back and nearly won it. So it's kind of crazy.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing I saw at the end of the Calgary game, Rochester was just sitting on this little bit of information, and they called out Jeff Snyder for wearing his Nikes. And so they get, I think the Cody Jamieson goal gets them back within one, and they go for the face-off, and then Snyder is sent off, and the ref's pointing at his shoes like this. And they couldn't figure out what was going on. And I remembered during the last game, it was last weekend, Stealth were in Calgary, and Brad Hawk, the equipment manager he's actually assistant GM now too. He's on the bench, and I think during the game tweeted out like, "Too bad Jeff Snyder can't wear the same gear as everybody else." And he's wearing Nikes, and then they show Snyder on the bench with tape trying to cover up his swooshes, I guess. And then I think he came back out later and played, but he missed one of the faceoffs late in the game when it was close, and it was because he was wearing the wrong shoes. And when that happened to Colin Doyle, they sent him off until he had the proper shoes on, not just covered up. And with Snyder, they just kind of let him back on the floor. I did not see him change his shoes at all. That was interesting, and I remember that, and I tweeted it out right away to Ryan Ballantyne, the Calgary broadcaster, and they kind of mentioned it, and then once you could hear them, which is ridiculous. You can hear them saying like, "Look at like you going back and forth, passing the tweet back and forth between each other as they were describing. It's like, yeah, I think he's like somebody just said that he's like not wearing the regulation gear, the sponsored gear." Felt proud of myself there. Graham, they call you out by name, but I think they called out my tweet indirectly.
That's true.
Yeah, it could be definitely dependent on the ref, because I remember the game you were talking about where Doyle did get sent off, and everyone was wondering if he would even come back, whether or not he was ejected for illegal equipment, like Cosmo was one game against the Mammoth. So yeah, I wonder how much of that is the ref and how much of that is gray area in the rule.
I'd be interested to look at the rule book, because there may be a different rule for wearing equipment that's illegal versus equipment that, because I'm pretty sure there's an actual rule in there that says if you're not wearing sponsored equipment, or equipment by the right company or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
then you have to go change. But I think it's two separate rules. So one of them, I guess basically one of them is considered cheating and one of them is considered not nice to our sponsor. So go fix it. Though I think when Doyle had his problem, he had to actually go borrow a pair of shoes from somebody else because he didn't have any.
You got it from the
Why he
trainer.
didn't have any, that doesn't make any sense to me. If that's the sponsor of the league, then it should be fairly obvious that you should have some of those shoes handy.
Yeah, the first Calgary game in Toronto this year, on NL.com, they had a picture of Jeff Shatler and some Rock player battling for a ball on the boards, and Shatler was right there wearing his swoosh and his Nikes. I don't know if he was also wearing this game still, or if that was so obvious when they looked at it, like, yeah, you got to change your shoes before you come out again. Get a little message from the league.
Okay, game number 3, Minnesota and Philly. Minnesota had only one win going into this game, but it was in Philadelphia. So I imagine the Wings were not looking at a 1-17 thinking this is just a 1-17, this should be easy, because they were the one. I saw most of this game, but it was kind of on in the background. I wasn't really paying an awful lot of attention to it. I did like the Wings uniforms, though. They had the orange thing happening with the Flyers crossover kind of deal. So I can only imagine the Flyers are going to be doing a Wings thing at some point. And watch me hold my breath for that to happen. Did you guys see more of this game than I did?
I half watched it, half listened to it. It was definitely an interesting game. The Wings were very dominant in the first, but you could just tell in the second half. I don't know if the Wings just thought they had it or what, or if just the Swarm had that second burst of energy. But the second half, Mini looked just a lot stronger, a lot more cohesive. They just had a burst of energy, and then they took the lead for the first time and just never gave it up. I mean, not to mention Logan Schuss, I think it is. He had 5 goals on 11 shots. I mean, that definitely was pretty big. So it was definitely one of those kind of. It was a strong game, but there wasn't anything that was really attention getting that really sticks out in my memory. Other than the fact that Zach Higgins, the goalie for the Wings, was the only thing that kept it from going into overtime. So the Wings should be very, very, very thankful to have him on their team, because other than that, or not the Wings, Mini, sorry. The Swarm should be glad to have him on the team, because he was the only thing that kept it from going into overtime, because the shot was right there and he saved it. So, did you watch this one, Tyler?
Yeah, it's kind of the same as you guys. I had it in the background while I was working. I was cleaning out the garage, but I just had the tablet up there. I could pretty much see as much as I watched. And it was an exciting game. First half, again, felt dominant for Philly, but they never got more than 2 or 3 away, so they always had left room for Minnesota to know that they can just have a hot quarter and come back. And that's what they did in the fourth quarter again. I guess the kind of the story with the Seattle Seahawks and NFL was like they were too young to know better when they were going through all the playoffs, and I guess the Swarm right now are too young to know better. Like, oh, it's fourth quarter, we took 3 quarters off, or we just didn't play 3 great quarters, but I'm up for it. Let's go out and win. And they put in these fourth quarter performances together where they need to do better in the other 3 quarters, but you can't count them out. The first game of the season that I watched them, their second game was in Langley, and they didn't have a fourth quarter burst or confidence that they have now. So it's an improvement from where they were. They're still only 2-7, but they're showing some progression there that would make you worry about playing them in any game where you give them chances, and they see it as, all right, we got this. We still have a chance.
Here's a question for you guys, and I just thought of this now, and so I've given you no time to prepare for it. But as you mentioned, Melissa, Andrew Suter was tossed from the Toronto-Minnesota game on Friday night. He was fighting and he was declared the instigator, so he got the standard 2-5 in a game. And so halfway through the first quarter, the Swarm was playing without their captain. And obviously last year didn't happen because he was injured for most of it, but the previous year he was the team leader in penalty minutes. This seems like an odd thing for a captain to do. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the fighting, and that's not really what the point of this is. But and I understand now and again the fighting needs to happen, but should it be the captain of the team, the leader of the team, who goes out there and does that sort of thing and gets himself tossed from a game? That, I don't know. It seems to me like a very non-captain-like move. What do you guys think?
On average, no, but with Suter going back to, I think, his junior days, that's his style. But it's totally not what you want. I mean, the stealth collapsed without Sorensen on the floor. But the Swarm last year when he was injured, they all found a way to rally and do it. And Saturday they rallied and did as well, but didn't get all the way. But it's something that they can account for, but I would not say it's what you want.
Yeah, that's definitely kind of a sticky subject. It's you kind of, when you think of a captain, you definitely think of somebody that has these leadership qualities, and part of being a leader is setting a good example. But you also want a leader that's kind of can throw down a little bit. It's definitely hard because when we had Gavin Proud as the captain, he was definitely kind of like Suter. He wasn't afraid to mix it up, but he was pretty good about choosing his timing about when he would go into a fight and when he wouldn't. Whereas some players definitely don't seem to have that. But it was such a contrast to like John Gallant when he was there, because he's overall, every time I met him, he's very even-tempered, really super nice guy. And usually if he's getting mixed up in something on the field, he's not the one that instigated it, and usually he's very much on the receiving end and taking a lot of cheap shots that kind of take him out. So, it's one of those things. I think it can be an important part of the game, and knowing when to use that to kind of spark a fire under your team might be good. But when you're kicked out of the game, then your leadership qualities don't matter because you're not there to support your team. And maybe that is actually what helped the Swarm nearly take it on the Friday night game, is because they didn't have, or Saturday, they just didn't have their leader, and so somebody stepped it up and was like, hey, rah, 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 we can go, we can take this. And I don't know, it's definitely a polarizing issue. Fans are definitely pretty much on one side or the other, that fighting is just a part of the game and the fights need to be allowed and almost encouraged. And then on the other side, you have that fights shouldn't be part of the game. We're not going to be taken seriously with them. So when you see a captain doing it, it definitely has a different connotation to it than when just a player does it.
Okay, our next topic should also be an interesting one.
Actually, before we get into that, Graham, I'm sorry. Oh. Since we're still kind of talking about the games, I actually just pulled up the sponsorship equipment requirements, if you guys are interested.
Sure.
So, Rule 26.3, sponsorship equipment requirements: only NLL-sponsored equipment shall be worn unless prior approval by the league, and only authorized official NLL suppliers' logos marks must be displayed on the player's uniform and/or equipment, which also includes the shaft and head of the stick. Any player or goalie not complying with this rule shall not be eligible to play until such time the player or goalie removes non-NLL-sponsored equipment and/or non-authorized logos marks. Game officials shall assess appropriate penalties should the player return and still be non-compliant. Any player who has been found to have marked up, blocked, or misrepresented any logos or marks shall be reported to the league office and is subjected to a fine. But it's also interesting because one of the rules, actually, let me get back up to it, 17.3, officials' duties regarding player equipment, 17.2, sorry. It shall be the referee's duty to see that all players are properly dressed and that the approved regulation equipment, including the approved on-field branded exposure program, is in use at all times during the game. So that almost sounds like the refs are actually supposed to make sure they're looking at everybody's equipment, and I mean, what ref's actually going to do that?
Well, the swoosh should stick out, but maybe they're actually concentrating on something else. Could be a very nice lady in the crowd catching the ref's eye. These guys don't watch everything.
Some more so than others. Okay, Graham.
Okay. That's interesting. The other topic we wanted to talk about was we hinted to this last week. What was the greatest individual performance that you have seen in an LL game? Tyler, this was your idea, and a good one it was, I think. So I'll let you go first.
So I had this in my mind. I don't know if I can still pick one, but I would say the number one performance I remember is Brian Langtree in Portland. He scored 9 goals one night, and just I don't know if it was the Portland goalies because they were never the greatest, but I think everything he threw at the cage, he had behind the backs, outside, inside, everything. He was having a blast that night. And so I remember the time that he scored 9 goals. Saw him the next morning in the airport as we were flying to San Jose, and it's like I never met him. I was just like at the airport, it's like, you Brian Langtree? I go, yeah, he had a good game last night. He's smile that was just so huge. He's just like, thanks, that was a lot of fun. I was like, yeah, I think anytime you score 9 goals is great. It was great performance. The other one that came to my mind is also important. There's great games in Portland. Is in 08 with Iannucci, his MVP goal scoring year. He had 6 goals, and Dan Dawson had 6 goals. They had dueling sock tricks going back and forth in that game. And I asked my wife, because she's seen almost every game I have, and the first thing that she came to her mind was in New Jersey for a Titans game, Stealth at Titans, Colin Doyle made a performance that it wasn't the most greatest statistical effort, but he absolutely went out there and said, we're not losing this game because of me. Get on my back, guys. We're going to go. And he had 6 goals, I think maybe 5 in the second half, maybe 7 goals total, 6 in the second half. It was outrageous. And the other 4 guys on offense couldn't accomplish anything. But Doyle went out and did whatever he wanted, and it was so cool to watch. And it still lost the game, and it was a total bummer, but sorry, it was more than just one. I couldn't narrow it down. We've seen too many games. But that was the greatest performances that we've seen. How about you, Melissa?
You know, I had a really, really hard time with this one because, unfortunately, I just don't have a memory for the specifics for the most part. So I remember seeing a lot of great games, but narrowing it down to one player, they're not sticking out. But what really just has stuck out for me, and of course they're both Mammoth, because that's, what brought me into the game, and I think that's why they're the strongest memories. But the 2006 season, just watching G Nash and net, there was just many of those games, he was just like a brick wall. And I especially remember that playoff game where he was struggling a little bit, and then Chris Levis came in for him, and then Nash came back, after that. And he was just a brick wall after that. And it's like that season, he was just the center of that defense, and really just, when you see a goalie make some of those crazy saves, it was like he was just standing on his head, just blocking the stuff. I mean, it was amazing, and that was definitely one of those memorable things. And then one of the other things I always think about is what made me really like John Gallant, why he became my favorite defensive player, and it's because he's just not a very big guy. You meet him, and he's like 5'10", 6 foot, somewhere around there. He's not a huge guy, but just watching him like against the Morgan brothers, where you're like, okay, how tall is this guy? You know, 6'8" and stuff. But he would just be on those guys and just he was like a pit bull. You know, they'd throw him off and he's right back on him. You know, just preventing him from getting anywhere near the net. And it was just it's those kind of things that really stick. You know, Brian Langtree with his diving goals. I mean, he just had those crazy goals that somehow always seemed to go in. But they're highlight reel worthy and they were just crazy. And I mean, he definitely took some punishment. I remember the first year when he got into the crease with Dwight Metke, and Metke just speared him. You know, it was definitely a crazy game. So that's kind of mine, but it's like I know I've seen some amazing performances. Like you were saying, you know, Ian Nucci's first year and Langtree's 9-goal game and you know the sock tricks and stuff. It's just like I've seen these amazing games, but nothing wanted to really stick out. What about you, Graham?
I picked a couple. Again, I've seen lots of games over the last 12 years or so. I mean, I've seen the Gates, and I've seen Tavares, and I've seen Grant, and I've seen all these great players. And none of them really stuck out in my mind for some reason. The ones that I did remember and wanted to make note of, last year my son and I went to Buffalo to watch the Rock play there, and that was the night that Garrett Billings had 15 points. I actually don't remember the breakdown of goals versus assists. I think it might have been 5 and 10 or 4 and 11 or something like that. But he had a point on every single Rock goal in the game, which I don't think had ever been done before. So that was pretty darn impressive. In 2009, this was sort of the flip side of that. Buffalo was in Toronto, and they totally wiped the floor with the Rock, and I think the final score was 25-10. And in that game, Mark Steenhuis had 4 goals and an amazing 13 assists for 17 points. And the assists and the points, I believe, are still an NLL record for a single game. And that was pretty darn impressive. And 2009 was the tail end of the previous ownership in Toronto. And that was right before Terry Sanderson came back, and right before Colin Doyle came back, and right before Jamie Dow bought the team, and they went to the championship game the next year. And so 2009 was a pretty low time for Rock fans, and that game was probably the low point of that low time. But Steenhuis's performance was pretty damn impressive. Also, everybody else is mentioning Iannucci, so I will as well. I went to a Wings Bandits playoff game in Buffalo during Iannucci's MVP season, and I don't remember what year it was. 2008, maybe.
Yeah.
Whatever year that was. Was it 8? And I had no particular rooting interest in this game. I didn't care who won or anything, but we were right down close to the glass, and so a couple of times I'd see like the whole Philadelphia offense get set up, and Iannucci was basically standing right in front of me, and he's a pretty big guy, but just his presence on the floor was outstanding. And I don't even remember whether he like set any records or had a 6-goal night or anything like that. I don't have any idea what kind of stats he put up in that game, but I remember being pretty impressed just watching him, and he just had this presence, like, give me the ball and I'll score, and he did an awful lot. So I just remember being impressed by his performance in that game. And I picked a couple of defensive ones as well. When I started going to Toronto Rock games, this was 2001. They had won the 99 championship. They had won the 2000 championship. And then I started going in 2001, and they got to the championship game again. And so it was just, okay, well, obviously they're going to win this, because I don't think they lost a single home game that year. And the championship game was in Toronto against the Wings. And it was Dallas Elliott versus Bob Watson, 2 of the greatest of all time. And Elliott just put on a show, and he was outstanding. And he was one of the main reasons that the Wings won that game. And yeah, so I remember watching Elliott and thinking, holy crap, this guy's good. And I've been watching Bob Watson all year, so when you're impressed by another goalie after Bob Watson, that's pretty good. The other one was Bob Watson, in the 2011 championship game, which was his last game in the NLL. He'd already announced his retirement and everything, and it was just the perfect Cinderella story that you go out on top, you go out winning a championship, you go out as the game MVP, the whole deal. And I remember thinking during the game, if the Rock win this game and it's not like a 1917 game, they might just give the game MVP to Watson anyway, even if he's not the best player, just because it's his last game and the whole deal. But he absolutely deserved the MVP of that game, I think. So watching that was yeah, it was a very very special game for Rock fans in general, I think.
Yeah, we've had some great goalies that just we've been fortunate to watch. I mean, between watching Elliott and Watson and O'Toole, it's great watching some of these goalies. Some of these guys are just so amazing in what they do. And Bob Watson was another one that really wasn't a very big guy. He wasn't tall. He wasn't wide. I mean, when you saw like Moran, he was a big guy. I mean, he was heavy set. He was very wide and like 5'10" ish. So yeah, to see some of these players that they're really not that big of guys playing goalie and really doing it well is kind of crazy.
Okay, let's move on to our predictions for last week. And I was about to say we didn't have as good a week last week as we had previously, but that's only true for two of us. All four of us, I think, have been above 500 for the last 4 weeks or 5 weeks or some crazy thing like that. But this past week I was 1-2 and Melissa was 1-2. Tyler, however, gets another gold medal. He was 3-0, so nice job there.
Thank you, thank you.
So overall, Melissa is 22-17. I am 26-13, and Tyler takes over the lead with 27-12. So that's actually pretty good for all three of us, considering we're all over 500. So Tyler, with a 3-0 week, you get to go first with your predictions for the 3 games next week.
All right, we've got the Toronto-Alberta trip at Edmonton and then at Calgary. Edmonton 7-0. They say third team to ever do that, and they look like it. They look like they deserve to be where they are, and I can't see Toronto beating them. Edmonton hasn't been great at home. That's like the only thing against them at this point. But I would say historically not great at home, but this season they're obviously undefeated. But I'm going to go with Edmonton there to hold that game. Calgary continues their cushy home schedule. I think their 6th home game in the last 7 or 5 in the last 6. And that's the whole reason I had them winning against Rochester, is because they're at home and they've got a groove. And I see them continuing that against Toronto. So rotten luck for Toronto going on the road. I see them losing both games. And the last game is Rochester at Colorado. Colorado's 100th home game, supposedly. I've seen debate against that. I don't know. I like Rochester here. Again, with 2 weeks on the road in a row is difficult. But you got Matt Vince, and you've got Cody Jamieson, Dan Dawson. You can win games. So I'm going to go ahead and pick Rochester over Colorado. How about you, Graham?
Let's see. Yeah, this one was tough for me as a Rock fan. Toronto versus Edmonton. Yeah, it's one of these things where any team possibly could beat Edmonton, but the way Edmonton's playing, you'd kind of be a fool to bet against them. And the way Toronto has been playing the last couple of games anyway, I can't really, in good conscience vote for my own team there, so I'm going to go for Edmonton. And then to add insult to injury, I have to go with Calgary in the next game as well. Like I said, Toronto hasn't looked too good in the last couple of games. Calgary has. They have all kinds of confidence in their big comeback against the defending champion. So so I'm gonna have to go with the Nighthawks there, or the Roughnecks there. Sorry. Looking at the next game, Rochester and Colorado. Yeah, Rochester got beat, but by Calgary last week. But Matt Vince versus whoever the Colorado goalie du jour is going to be. I'm gonna have to go with Vince. Colorado's offense has certainly gotten better with Casey Powell and Drew Westervelt coming back, and Grant's obviously playing pretty well. Minus Adam Jones is not helping them. But yeah, I think I'm still going to go for the Nighthawks on that one. Melissa, what would you?
Well, like you guys with the Edmonton and Toronto game, the way Toronto's playing, there's no way I could pick them over Edmonton. I think Edmonton can be beat this season, but this Toronto team is not the one to do it, at least not right now. And, playing back-to-back games as inconsistent as they're playing, I think that's just going to be salt in the wounds for them, and I'll be surprised if Calgary doesn't take that one. Rochester and Colorado was a much harder one. Colorado's definitely playing inconsistent, so on that respect, I was very close to picking Rochester. But the way Rochester played this weekend, Colorado is one of those teams that if the right Colorado team comes out, I should clarify that if they give them that space that they gave in the game against Calgary, then Colorado actually does have that potential to come back. They can definitely do that. So it was a hard pick, but I'm gonna go with Colorado on this one. I think Colorado, having had this weekend off, might just be a little more well rested and fighting. At least that's the hope. They could come out very rusty. So I'm going with Colorado, but it's it's an iffy. So we'll see if I gain one of my games back from you guys, or if I just go further in that little hole.
All right. I guess that's it for this week's show, unless there's something else you guys wanted to mention. Next week we have a couple of interesting things. Obviously, we'll talk about the 3 games that we have just made predictions for, and we'll see if any other news comes up that we can discuss. But a couple of things that we want to talk about. I've done some number crunching, and I may do some more about the idea of the second assist. And there has been some talk in the past about whether the second assist is actually useful, whether it's meaningful. A lot of times there's just the ball being passed around anywhere, and the second assist happens to be given to somebody else who happened to be on the floor but wasn't really necessarily involved in the play. Other times there's obviously somebody who's definitely involved, but that is a bit of a controversy now and again. So I've done some numbers to see what the scoring stats would look like if the second assist were not included. So we'll talk about that a little bit and see where we get with that. And another interesting topic that we will throw out there will be our favorite failed team in the NLL. And this being the National Lacrosse League, we have a whole bunch to choose from. In fact, I think there's probably at least 4 cities that have 2 to choose from. Yeah, I can't think of them offhand, but we'll look over them for next week and see which one is our favorite. So that should be interesting. Yeah. So if you want to reach us, you can email feedback@addictedtolacrosse.com and send us whatever questions or comments you have on the show. You can also tweet us at Lax Podcast, and we'll respond there as well. All 3 of us are on Twitter, and our Twitter handles are on the screen, except for Melissa, who couldn't get that to work for some bizarre reason. She is Snow Kitten. And the website is addictedtolacrosse.com, and all of our shows will be posted up there for your perusal. So that's it for this week, and we will see you next Monday night.
See ya.